All right, greetings. This is Freedom Phil live from the wasteland out here. And what's the topic? Washington Post is laying off a bunch of people. This isn't a new thing. This has been going on in the industry for ages. But why is that? And the simple answer for it is, well, there's no trust in the media. Because what's the difference between the mainstream media and some propagandist on a radio station or anywhere else? Yeah. And when you get more accurate results from someone on the internet than you're getting from the people that claim tell you the truth, that might explain a lot of this shit. Yeah, this is Freedom Phil. Like, subscribe. Let's get into it. Always turn up the video speed. And why do I always say that? Because turn up the video speed. It's literally what I'm telling you to do. You should be watching this at least at 1.75 if I upload it. That's why I named the channel this. Let's get into it. So, Washington Post's been around forever. They've done a lot of slop reporting over the number of years, and you see the same thing with all the sort of games, journalists type of people, where when did they start going downhill? About the same time that Gamergate happened. You know, when people stopped having trust for the people that were told to lead it, when we could start seeing there was more of an agenda, activist agenda. And let's be honest, they've been riding the fumes. Like whether it was government money funding a lot of these organizations, and the same people that told you, learn to code, coal miners, learn to code, person in a trade that's, failing because our government sold your job overseas, learn to code. Well, hey, I don't think there's enough coding jobs for all these failure journalists. And, some of them are decent people, but let's be honest, you picked a bad profession. It's back to McDonald's, as Asmongold would say. Honestly, yeah, this is where you always should have been. And my thing about a lot of the mainstream media is, let's go over the mechanics of this. What was the generation that mostly trusted in the mainstream media? Well, the generation that didn't have the internet. Let's be honest, you go back in time to when we were kids, there was no internet, there was no this, there was, if you were lucky, you had cable TV. And the generation that it was raising kids at that point, basically they were lucky if they had, more than 4 or 5 stations. So you just got whatever the world showed you. Why were people more literate, more, reading proficiency was vastly better? Because people read newspapers, right? People listened to the radio, people watched whatever's on TV, and they only had limited options. So other forms of entertainment, like for instance, reading books or reading magazines, newspapers and whatnot, this was a way to, enjoy life. People were actually, if you watch old speeches from back in the day of presidential speeches or any sort of political, you'll notice that the language was far more intelligent. And why? Because that was what was expected of the people at the time. We did have, if nothing else, it was an era of higher education. But because there was such a lack and such a control over what people were allowed to see via the media, then yes, whatever narrative they threw out there for the most part, if, from, the lamestream, legacy media, dinosaur media, whatever they put out, people believed it for the most part, because what other message did they get? Or if they didn't believe it, because people had known they'd been getting lied to for ages, effectively, what was their alternative? And this is where actually, before the internet became a major thing, this is where we saw, AM talk radio start taking a bite out of the machine. Because like guys like Rush Limbaugh and other individuals, Mark Levin and others, whether you like them or hate them or whatever, alternative voices. And you'd also see this in some places, like in San Francisco, News Talk 810 KGO. You could hear people on both sides giving a conversation. I remember late night Gene Burns and whatnot, the anti-nuclear nuts. These people were at the beginning of alternative styles of thought, as far as conversations. One might even argue that part of this was inspired from the kind of counterculture you saw kind of in the 60s and whatnot, whether you're Republican or Democrat, the idea that you should question the people that are telling you what you're thinking. And you could actually see more of this in the situation where, as we got to the internet age, now it was like we didn't just have to accept whatever the media was showing us. We could actually just go out there and produce the media of ourselves. Like we could go out and take a recording and we're like, there it is, and then people would have conversations about this. Before everything was AI generated and that nonsense, we could actually see, what was happening on the ground. We didn't need a filter. And that is when, by the way, did you notice over the last 15 years or longer, actually 20 years, they have been trying to tell you, don't take anything on the internet seriously. Now, I'm not saying take everything on the internet seriously, but these are the same people that know that their fan base, by the way, the generation that didn't have the internet, bringing it back to that, those people are dying off. Like, I love airwave TV, but let's be honest, airwave TV does not have the money behind it that it used to. Because, and this is also where airwave TV actually has something nice where they can show you all the old stations through multiple different channels. You could have one digital channel that has 10 stations. So whatever you want to watch that they've ever produced is probably there. But what's the point of that? The generation that would be enjoying this legacy format is dying off. And the new generation, they're way more skeptical than our parents were. I'd argue, and this is kind of a wild thought, maybe there's another one, but being real about it, did the death of was the apex, the high point of the legacy media, Watergate? Was there anything bigger than Watergate? Like, that's the one they all reflect back to. I mean, you could argue the what happened in the 80s and the 90s with like CNN and then Fox News. But the actual sort of journalism, Watergate was the top of it. And after that, there hasn't been anything close to come to that. That's when like everybody pretty much took the media as most seriously as they ever could. After that, eventually it started becoming this showboat media, rock star, like, yeah, Fox News. Now, we've watched both parties, be it right or left, basically, curtail the narrative. And their businesses, let's be honest, these news organizations have always been businesses. And they're in the best interest of continuing to sell you whatever makes them money. So along comes people in the internet, whether it's YouTube, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, people that are actually just having real conversations, showing real footage. And the lamestream media can't compete against that because people are like, well, hey, man, you guys have been telling us this narrative for how long? And now it turns out we're looking at it. And you guys have been spinning it the whole time. I mean, what was O'Reilly's big statement? No spin. Bullshit. That guy was spinning the whole time. But the point is, now that we don't have to go to these people, then it comes down to the question. What is it better to be? Are you better as a misinformed person or an uninformed person? Yeah, it's a wild question there, isn't it? Are you better misinformed or uninformed? Well, let me tell you something about it. There was a writer, you can put it in the comments later, who said, it's easier to fool a person than it is to convince a person they've been fooled. Who was that? This guy, I think I wrote Tom Sawyer or something like that. It's better to be misinformed. It's easier to convince somebody of your misinformation to convince them they've been misinformed. Now think about that for a second. And why is that? Because people get into the concept that, no, I couldn't possibly be fooled. No. They get offended. They get angry. And they're like, you're telling me I was fooled? I've seen this with my own family members. Where it's like, nah, man, look at this. And they're like, no, that's just some crap on the internet. And then down the road, when that crap on the internet turns out, hey, that was fucking true. They'll all try to shuffle off like, oh, well, whatever. Broken clock right twice a day. Now, translation, people get so stuck on the concept that they can't be fooled and what they believe is right, that actually someone who's uninformed and comes from a neutral perspective is better off at times than the misinformed. Because the misinformed will take it as an ego trip. They don't want to admit that they were duped. As where the person that's neutral on the outside might look at things with honest eyes. They might look at the world and say, yeah, well, why are we doing this? Like, instead of telling people why you have to have a sea of immigrants or money going overseas or we're bombing some other country, they might look at it and go, well, what the hell the good does that do for me? They'll have an honest conversation from where they stand. Versus the misinformed, which have already been propagandized to, whichever side you're on, the misinformed will fight because they really believe they're not only right, but God forbid they were ever fooled. And how many people's hubris will basically allow them to perpetuate their own misinformation? So that's why, in some respects, that's what's so scary for the legacy media these days about the idea of the alternative media, whether it's YouTube or some online sites. YouTube's catered as well. Make no mistake, YouTube's got a leftist bend. So the fact that we're even having this conversation, it'll be suppressed. The situation is simple, though. When you can go out and seek out the information yourself, and then you start looking into multiple different sources and whatnot, you don't need these arbiters of what you're allowed to hear, say, and think. And that worked for the greatest generation and the boomers. Gen X, it worked on most of them too. But the younger versions of Gen X and the millennials are more likely to go out there and look for alternative sources. The Zoomers, they look at the nighttime news as maybe if they're scrolling through the TV, here's Tom with the weather. That's about all they might care about. And they're getting that from their phone. They're not even watching TV. It is the end of the era of someone telling you via their big pulpit what to think. It's now the era of the independent. This is actually, freedom of the press is now actually something that's more realistic than it's ever been. And now the problem is, with all the misinformation we've had decade after decade for as long as we've been alive, now people can't trust anything whatsoever. But it's funny, there's an irony. Like, for instance, I've kind of held back on talking about the Epstein thing for a time now because I haven't bothered to research some of the new material. But it is turning out that some of the Podesta Pizzagate things are now starting to look more and more real. Like, hey man, this isn't a joke. This isn't some Alex Jones conspiracy. And what does it say when some of the conspiracy theorists, as they like to label them, or we should just say inconvenient truth, unpopular truth to the powers that be, when the people come out there and they say these things, and then it turns out 10, 15 years later, there it is. They were right. What does that say about your mainstream media that covered for all of that? That went out of their way to suppress, fired people for even researching these things. We are now in a better era because the lamestream media is dying off. And I get it. It sucks if you're one of those journalists at the Washington Post. But let's be honest, you were producing slop propaganda for ages. You were trying to control the way people think, the way people act, in the same way that they convince you that if you're a man, you got to be going out there and slaying as many bitches and whatnot. You got to have this car, you got to have this life. They're trying to convince you an entire way to be, and you know why? Because it's good business. Selling you a lifestyle, a way to be, a way to think, a thing to be angry about. That's why they give a shit. It's exactly why. And now, the average person can find the information for themselves. And to some degree, I gotta be real, I think the fatigue that people have with the media at this point has gotten to maybe a place where some people are seeking a new form of inner peace. Where they're going out there, and instead of just tying on to whatever the lamestream media says, or what narrative they're told to care about, if you're right or left, both sides have the thing. They're now going out and just looking for their own way of life. They're like, fuck the news, fuck the media. We're just going to go out and go hiking. We're going to go garden. We're going to do our own things. People are less robotic than previous generations. And they're just going out and being their own independent thing. And that's something that really scares the system. When they can't control you with their narratives and their ways of thinking, and your happiness comes from within, what can they sell you if you're already satisfied? So yeah, I'm glad to see that legacy media finally becoming the fossils it's already been for years. And I'm glad to see, if a guy like Nick Shirley could go out and do a YouTube video that basically with pretty much how many multiple millions of people saw, had more impact than anything the lamestream legacy media has done in years. I mean, one might argue the only thing that the lamestream media has anymore is a fake protest and maybe something to talk about Epstein and people pretending to be outraged about Border Patrol. That's all they have. They don't have anything left. And we can get a better version of all of that independently online. And here's another thing, just as a closing thought. Where media has gone is that we don't need somebody who's being paid multiple $1 million in an office to tell us what to think. We don't need the chairs. If some guy's really good at sports and has great analogy of sports, and people begin to gravitate towards that sports individual and their commentary, that person can make their channel. You know, that person can just make their channel and people start following what they're saying. If somebody has an interesting conversation like Joe Rogan, like someone has that type of interesting conversation, people just they'll gravitate and be like, hey, I like what that guy's saying. In some respects, it's kind of, I bemoan the fact that airwave TV, for instance, is disappearing slowly but surely. But I love the fact that the independent individual, like I love the idea I can go back and watch some old school shows. But the fact that we can actually have conversations about anything we want these days versus the controlled atmosphere. I mean, has it not been better for artists, if nothing else? Like, let's just say, I know a lot of people have issues with them, but, you got fandoms like Star Wars people or Star Trek, or what about the furries? You got people who like to go out and do, live action, medieval stuff, or people who, whatever thing you're into, motorsports, whatever, there is people out there for your deal. Now, when the term YouTube actually really is accurate in the sense that you have entire communities that actually cater. Let's just say back in the day, you and a few other people in your community or your county were the only people that like something. Well, now there's a whole community worldwide where you can have conversations. It is not the controlled message that it used to be of what you do, what's acceptable, blah, blah, blah. You're no longer some like fringe radical for doing your own fucking thing. Like van life and like what I do or trucking, it used to be that was some on the fringes thing. Now it's just like there's a community out there where you have people that are like you. Alternative living out in the woods, off grid, where you want to be a gardener, a farmer, or people that happen to be religious. They can all gather together in some weird way. The world is not the controlled atmosphere. And the reality is, the legacy media is dying off because the world that they had of no internet, and before there was AM radio competing, the world they had, the apex of their world was Watergate. Now, that's the past. And by the way, I appreciate anybody who's subscribed, and I appreciate anybody who's hit the like button, and anybody who's bought me subscribers. I really appreciate that. And I'm just going to go back to... I'm going to prep some food, maybe bake a cake today. Peace.